Hi everyone, I'm Dan Ulrich. I'm in the Meteorology and Measurements Division at the Air District, here to provide an update on our air toxics monitoring project that we're planning and coming to you from my kitchen during this shelter in place. So let's start with a recap from our February steering committee meeting. If you recall that we considered options for additional air monitoring projects that were designed to help provide data sets and inform on air quality concerns that the initial monitoring projects were not designed for. And after considering some options for these projects, the steering committee voted to move forward with a project focused on air toxics measurements. So what are air toxics? Air toxics comprise a group of pollutants that are known or suspected to cause cancer or other serious health effects. Air toxics in general are not as widespread at high concentrations like other common pollutants such as ozone or PM2.5, but air toxics are still of major concern because they can cause these health effects even at low concentrations. Air toxics can be gases, particles, diesel particulate matter is considered an air toxic as well. This project in particular is going to focus primarily on volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. So these are gas air toxics. They include many different chemical compounds and can come from many different sources. So what are some examples of these volatile organic compounds? Well, benzene is one. We've talked a little bit about benzene at some past steering committee meetings. But benzene, toluene, ethylene, and xylene, which we'll refer to here as BTEX, are air toxics that are commonly associated with petroleum operations, but can also come from other sources. So really anything involving gasoline. So mobile sources, cars and trucks, for example, can produce these BTEX compounds as well. Another subset of air toxics is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's kind of a mouthful, so we'll abbreviate that as PAHs. And these are typically produced through burning any type of fuels, whether it's oil, gas, coal, or wood, for example. And so activities like using a fireplace or a wood stove can produce these PAHs. And another example would be certain types of food preparation, so like charbroilers or barbecue can produce PAHs as well. So what are some overall goals of this monitoring project? Well, one is to locate places where levels of air toxics are much higher than in surrounding areas and determine if there are potential sources of those air toxics in or nearby those places. We can also compare relative levels of air toxics from one location or one neighborhood to another. We can compare measurements from this project to those from existing monitors because there are a few stationary monitors in Richmond and São Paulo that are measuring certain types of air toxics. And then of course we want to use the data from this study to help inform and strategize emissions and exposure reductions efforts. So as we're currently planning for this project, there are some key questions that we're considering. One is where are the known or potential sources of air toxics in Richmond, São Paulo, and what air toxics do or could they emit? And that kind of gets into the second question then is what air toxics should we target in this study? And there are some different types of information that we can use to help answer those questions. One are emissions inventories, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Another are the community identified concerns. So those are all of the sources of concern that you as the steering committee helped identify during our mapping activities last year. We also have information on odor complaints. So those are complaints that are submitted by the public to the Air District. And then we also have information on our own measurement capabilities. For example, we know that there are certain air toxics that we think we'll be able to measure better than other air toxics. So I mentioned that we can use emissions inventories as one piece of information to help plan this air toxics project. One emissions inventory is for permitted facilities. Permitted facilities are facilities that have air quality permits with the Air District. There are over 200 of these facilities across Richmond, São Paulo, They're shown in the map there on the right. The emissions inventory for these facilities contains the amounts of certain pollutants, including some air toxics, that a facility reports that they emit. The requirements of what and how facilities report emissions are often very specific. So the emissions inventory doesn't tell us everything about all air toxics emissions across Richmond San Pablo, but it is a piece of information that we can use. And there are many other sources of air toxics in addition to permitted facilities. There are mobile sources, so cars and trucks, trains and ships, for example. There are also area sources. Area sources are generally smaller sources that are scattered across the area. So like things like gasoline-powered equipment or restaurants, those can be considered area sources. So our overall approach to this monitoring project will be to begin with exploratory screening for air toxics to identify places where concentrations are particularly high. And we'll be using the Air District's mobile lab, or the van, to do this exploratory screening. From the emissions inventory and from the sources of concern that you've identified as a steering committee, we know that the corridor roughly along Richmond Parkway from North Richmond down through the harbor area contains many of the known and potential sources of air toxics, both large sources and smaller sources, and includes several adjacent neighborhoods, because we also want to get a sense for what air toxic concentrations are like in areas where you live and work and spend time. So across this area, and that's highlighted here on the map on the right, we can screen for some common air toxics like benzene, for example, because those air toxics can be emitted from a wide variety of sources, so it makes sense to screen for them across a larger area. But we can also target for specific air toxics depending on what sources are nearby. For example, when we're monitoring up near the landfill or other waste management facilities, we know that those types of facilities will produce certain types of air toxics, so we'll want to be measuring for those specifically when we're monitoring near them. The process of doing this exploratory screening is meant to be flexible. That's partly because this type of hyperlocal air toxics monitoring hasn't really been done before in this area. So there's some question of what the data are actually going to look like. So from day to day, the data are really going to inform how to focus in on identified problems or whether to expand to another area. When high concentrations are found, we know we'll want to follow up with additional measurements to help better understand those areas and identify possible sources. So an overall timeline for this monitoring project, so right now we're in springtime, we're in the planning phase for this, where we're gathering, again, updated emissions inventory and other related data sets to help put together a more detailed plan for these measurements. We hope to begin exploratory screening for gas air toxics using the van this summer. And I'll note here that this timeline is highly dependent, of course, on the ongoing shelter in place. But through that exploratory screening, we aim to locate places with high concentrations and begin evaluating possible sources and starting to look at determining if those places are near vulnerable populations. And then the following phase is to take a closer look at some of those areas where we do find higher concentrations using either the van again or some other measurement capabilities to better understand and characterize those areas where we do find higher air toxics concentrations. And throughout this process, we want to continue bringing routine updates to the steering committee so that we can inform emissions and exposure reductions efforts. So the immediate next steps for this project are, after this presentation, please provide your feedback and questions using the comments here on Open Air Forum. The Air District will be incorporating your responses and bringing a built-out plan for the next steering committee meeting. And again, we hope to begin exploratory screening measurements this summer or about a month after the shelter in place is lifted. So that wraps up our update on the air toxics monitoring project. Again, please leave your feedback and questions using Open Air Forum. I look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully in person next time. Take care.